everybody, thank you so much for clicking on this video. Today we're gonna dive into what functional training actually looks like. I definitely branded myself very early on in YouTube with like functional training, and I will be the first to say that my mindset has shifted a lot when it comes to approaching training, especially from a functional lens. You know, I originally treated training functionally like a checklist. You have to hit X, Y, and Z, and if you don't, then it's not functional. But I've found over the years that that's actually a very closed-minded approach and really takes the individual out of the equation. So today I really just look at functional training as purposeful training. Like, it's functional if it has a purpose. Does what you have programmed actually support your goals? That's it. So as long as you can justify what's in your program according to your goals, I think it's functional. Let's take a few examples here. Let's say one of your goals is to just live long and maintain your independence. Here's what functional training looks like to me then. I'm gonna recommend you hit 2 to 3 full body strength sessions a week, making sure in those sessions you're hitting both bilateral and unilateral variations of exercises. We also wanna make sure that we're working knee dominant and hip dominant. In terms of upper body, we wanna make sure that we have upper body push and pulling movements, both in the horizontal and the vertical plane. Ideally, we're working in different planes of motion. So, you know, if one of our goals is just to like live long and be healthy, if we think about what life gives us, we're gonna move in 360 degrees. So we wanna make sure that our training mimics that as well. Same thing with tempos. We don't always move slow. We don't always move fast. We wanna make sure that we have a variety of different tempos so that when we experience those different tempos and the force that comes with them in daily life, we're not open to injury. We also wanna make sure we're getting some power work in there, both understanding how to create force and absorb force. I've said this a lot, but as we age, we do actually lose our power at nearly double the rate that we lose our speed. People don't really understand why that's so important just with that statistic, but power training isn't just about like slamming a medicine ball. That's gonna be an example of creating force, right? And that is important, but we also have to think of power as that other side of it where we learn how to absorb force. So if you have to hop off of something, that's absorbing force. If you take a fall, that's absorbing force. That's all power work. So again, if we don't train for that, but your goal is to live a long and healthy life, that's not gonna be super functional. And then finally, just to touch on cardio, since we are talking about training and cardio is part of a well-rounded training program, the current recommendations are making sure that we get 150 minutes of moderate intensity cardio per week and or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic movement during the week. Let's take another goal example, and let's say you wanna build a juicy butt. So to build muscle, obviously there's gonna be a nutritional component of this, but I just wanna stick to the training part. So I would recommend hitting your glutes 2 to 3 times a week. I'm not saying you have to do 100% glute focused sessions 3 times a week, but we do wanna make sure that we're getting enough reps, enough volume to actually stimulate muscle growth. Same thing we talked about with the previous goal. We do still wanna make sure that we're hitting both bilateral and unilateral variations. We also wanna make sure that we're hitting the glutes from both the shortened and the lengthened position. So essentially what that means is, where are you loading the glutes the heaviest? Is it when the muscle is shortened, or is it when the muscle is lengthened? Some examples here, working in the shortened position would be a hip thrust. A lengthened position would be a deadlift. We also wanna make sure that with a glute growth goal, I feel like this goes without saying, but there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. We need to be working loaded exercises. So like donkey kicks, fire hydrants, even if you're using a band, it's really not going to stimulate the muscle enough for true growth unless you are 100% beginner, you've never done anything before in terms of like training. And the reason I point out bands really quickly is actually my final point here, is that bands are typically going to load the muscle in the concentric phase. So that's the shortening phase of the muscle. Even though we do want to work that as well, just again, for a well-rounded functional glute, most muscle growth is actually going to be primarily stimulated in the eccentric phase of the contraction, or the lengthening. So if you're only working with bands, you're really gonna be limiting yourself to only really loading that concentric phase, at least easily, unless you have some crazy rig and some crazy setup. So I'm always gonna push for loaded exercises rather than body weight or bands, with a goal like building a juicy butt. Bands have a time and a place. Body weight has a time and a place, but we have to remember we're thinking functionally. What's gonna get us to our goal? It's not about just throwing random shit against the wall and seeing what sticks. And then a final goal example is if you wanna get your first push-up. So first thing I'm actually gonna do is check for some mobility requirements, making sure that we have full wrist extension, because that's gonna be the position that we hold our plank from. We don't wanna load our entire body weight onto a position that we can't own in a joint. We're also gonna need shoulder internal rotation for push-ups. Once you start to lower down, your shoulder does actually have to internally rotate. And then finally, I'm gonna check for shoulder extension. So again, as we come down into our push-up, your shoulders have to extend back behind the trunk. So that's the first thing I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna address those mobility restrictions as needed with different corrective drills that we sprinkle in throughout your training. Now getting into the actual push-up practice, in your sessions when you're practicing your push-ups, because it's actually one of your main goals, you're gonna wanna put it at the top of your training. What I typically do with people is we'll do movement prep, and then we'll work into either power or skills work, or maybe we'll superset it together. And the reason for this is because you're gonna have more energy at the top of your workout. So if this is your goal, but you're not practicing it till the end of your workout when all of your energy is depleted, doesn't make sense, right? Again, we're thinking functionally, purposefully. Another thing to consider with a push-up goal is just making sure that you're working from the shoulder in all different directions. We don't only want to train that horizontal push. Shoulder is a ball and socket joint, so if we are neglecting all of the other movement patterns that it can do, we're gonna open ourselves up to a lot more risk of injury. And then the final thing I'm gonna recommend is nearly daily practice. That doesn't mean you need to go to failure every single day with your push-ups, but if you can take, I don't know, every commercial break from the show that you're watching at night and drop down and give me 1 or 2 push-ups, you're just gonna build more and more reps. We talked about this with the glute growth goal. If you wanna get better at something, if you wanna build something up, you need a lot of repetition, you need a lot of volume. So if you're only practicing your push-ups once a week with me in our one-to-one sessions, you're gonna have a really, really slow rate of success, rather than if you're taking it home and taking 2 minutes a day and just practicing on your own. So all of those examples, you can see functional training is just specific training. And those are actually the 3 most common goals that I have with my clients, and I have a pretty good success rate. But I've also noticed that as I work with more and more people, I have a lot of clients who actually participate in adult sports leagues, just for fun, nothing like super competitive. But I've really had to learn a lot more about how to train them specifically for the sport that they're partaking in. So for the remainder of this video, we're actually gonna go very sport specific, and I'm gonna talk about a different skill or a different movement pattern that you're gonna need in different sports. And I'm gonna show you not only the mobility requirements for it, but also how to train for it in your sessions. So let's go. First sport we're gonna look at is basketball. The specific movement pattern we'll focus on is the pivot, which is vital for anyone playing on the court. To perform this movement, we'll need to access internal hip rotation. To test this, we're actually gonna lay on the back and bring one leg up at a time into a 90-degree angle. From here, you'll bring your foot out to the side, keeping the knee in line with the hip. You can see this is a limitation of mine, but if you're also limited, I'm gonna recommend implementing a 90-90 pails rails drill. So you wanna start in a 90-90 position with the knee in line with the hip and ankle in a 90-degree angle. You'll start here with a 2-minute passive stretch, relaxing into the position. This will help your nervous system recognize it's a safe position to be in. Then I like to tuck in the front leg so it's out of the way, and we'll start our pails contraction. This is working the progressive tissue, meaning the tissue that gets us out of the movement. So you'll take a short isometric contraction of about 15 to 20 seconds, driving the foot into the ground and lifting the knee. Then the rails contraction, or regressive tissue, will work when we drive the knee down and try to lift the foot. The point of these contractions is to build more space and strength in your end ranges. This will not only give you more access to internal hip rotation over time, but you'll also be able to own that range of motion. Then, getting into the actual movement drill, I'm going to recommend a wall-referenced kickstand deadlift. You can perform this at the wall with a foam roller and any weight of choice. By actively driving into the foam roller, you're going to recruit more hip internal rotation and strengthen that specific joint movement needed for a pivot on the court. Next up is tennis. But we could also use this for the very popular pickleball, which a lot of my clients play right now. So the specific movement pattern that I'm thinking of here is a forehand swing, which is going to require shoulder adduction or bringing the arm across the body. The first test I'm going to perform is a simple shoulder CAR. CARS stands for controlled articular rotations, and it's essentially a really controlled joint circle. This shows me the exact strengths and weaknesses in your current range of motion. If for whatever reason you're limited in adduction at the shoulder, I'm going to implement a pails rails drill to create more space there. For this drill, you'll stand in a doorway with the arm across the chest until you feel a stretch through the tissue along the back of the shoulder. You'll hold the passive stretch for 2 minutes, then perform your 2 contractions. For our pails contraction, you're trying to push your arm through the doorway, like you're going to open it to the side. It won't move though, because there's obviously a wall in your way. Then for the rails contraction, you're going to pull the arm toward you without moving anything else. It might not move off the doorway, but as long as the intention is there, that's all that matters. Now, the actual strength drill I'd recommend is a chest fly. Lying down on a bench or the floor, arms are going to come out slowly with control and then pull back together over the chest. There's lots of tempos and rep schemes to play with here as you progress your programming, which is why I love this option. Fun fact, I actually went bowling to start out my bachelorette party. It's not that I love bowling, I'm just competitive and I thought it would be fun. Spoiler, it was. Now, if you also want to go bowling, you're going to need elbow flexion to hold the ball before you chuck it down the lane. To test this, we'll do some elbow cars. I don't find that a lot of people have a limitation here, but perhaps just a weakness. So if you're one of those people, we can do an elbow flexion pails rails. Using your other arm, you're going to get yourself into max elbow flexion and hold it for 2 minutes. For your pails contraction, try to straighten out the bent arm, but don't let yourself win. Then for the rails contraction, try to pull the arm in closer to your chest or getting into more flexion. Again, it might not move, but it's the effort that counts. Now, if you're ready for a strength drill, we're actually just going to do some bicep curls. Super simple, but specificity here is key. I often see the elbows leaving the side for bicep curls, which takes a lot of the work out of the bicep itself. On the flip side, I also often see a lack of control on the descent. It's not that you need to take a slower tempo, but you just need to make sure that you're lowering the weight and not gravity. Next up is baseball. Now we're going to look at throwing the ball, which requires internal rotation at the shoulder. First thing I'm going to do is test this range of motion, and I'm actually going to do this through a sleeper stretch. So you're going to lie on your side and bring the bottom arm in a few degrees from the shoulder. Bending at the elbow, you'll take your opposite hand and gently rotate the arm down toward the floor. If you're limited, we can actually do a sleeper pails rails to create more space. First, you'll hold the passive stretch for 2 minutes. Then for your pails contraction, we'll be trying to get out of the stretch. So you'll try and bring your forearm back up to the starting position, but don't let yourself win. Then for the rails contraction, you'll try to get the arm closer to the ground without compensating from the wrist or elbow. Once you have adequate range of motion here, we can actually load this and work on some eccentric neural grooving. You'll take the same position with the dumbbell of choice and slowly lower down to the floor for 3, 2, 1, and then use the other hand to help bring your arm back up. This is an excellent way to get really specific in strengthening the internal rotators as they're lengthening. Next up is golf. Very boring, but a lot of people do it. So we're going to specifically be looking at the swing, which requires a lot of elements, but we're going to single out thoracic rotation. To test this, I'm going to give you something to hold on to, like a medicine ball or a yoga block, and you're simply going to rotate side to side. If you're unable to isolate your spine from your hip points or your shoulders, we're going to implement a corrective drill. Now, I like a seated thoracic pails rails because it's super accessible no matter your level or your equipment. So seated on your chair, your bench, you're going to get yourself into your max rotation and hold for 2 minutes. For your pails contraction, you're going to try and come back to neutral, but don't let yourself win. You'll feel your obliques fire really quickly, so take your time easing into this one. Then for your rails contraction, let go of your chair or your legs and try to pull yourself into more thoracic rotation. Now, once we've really nailed this movement pattern, I'm going to implement different variations of med ball rotational throws. There's 1,000 ways to progress this, but eventually we want it to mimic the high to low aspect of a golf swing. Next up is soccer. For soccer, we're going to be looking at a shuffle, which requires hip adduction or bringing the leg toward the midline. To test this, I'll look at a simple standing hip car. The part I'm particularly looking at is bringing the leg across the body. If there's any limitation, compensation, or pinching there, we're going to want to implement a corrective drill. So for this corrective drill, we're going to take a side lying position with the bottom leg working, and this is going to be a hip adduction pails rails. We're specifically aiming to feel a stretch through the side of the hip on the bottom, not necessarily the side of the trunk. The more upright you are, the more you'll feel it through that specific tissue. So after holding this stretch for 2 minutes, our pails contraction will be to drive the bottom leg through the floor. Obviously, nothing will happen because the floor is there, but you should feel your hip abductors or your side butt working here. For our rails contraction, you're going to try and lift the leg off the floor without moving anything else. Now, your leg may or may not move here, but as always, it's not about what it looks like, it's about the intention behind it, and you're going to feel a ton of inner thigh. Now, these are smaller muscles, so just take your time ramping up the contraction, and once we have the required space and strength here, I'm going to recommend a lateral lunge plate drag for our strength drill. The added challenge of the plate drag specifically loads the inner thighs more than a traditional lateral lunge and is much more sport specific. Now we're going to go into some good old American football. Go Birds, baby. All right, so for football, there's a lot of options, but we're actually just gonna look at the more mobile players and talk about running. So running requires big toe extension for that push off, but unfortunately, since our feet are shoved into shoes with narrow toe beds and tons of cushion from a very young age, a lot of us end up losing that ability over time. So to test this, we're actually just gonna stand in a doorway and drape the big toe through it. If there's any limitation or tenderness, this is a sign that we need to strengthen this specific movement pattern. For our corrective drill, we're gonna actually perform this as a Pales Rails exercise. So you're gonna hold that big toe stretch for 2 minutes. Then for your Pales contraction, you're gonna try and push your big toe through the doorway. As always, since there's an immovable object there, nothing will happen visually, but you should feel the muscles of your foot working. Then for the Rails contraction, we're gonna try and lift the big toe out of the doorway without any other toes moving. This is a tricky one and you probably won't get any lift off, but again, it's the intention that matters more than what it looks like. Now, once we've got adequate big toe extension, I'm gonna recommend some calf raises. And we have all types to play with here. Single leg, weighted, deficit, tempo, straight leg, bent leg. Remember that running is a sport that won't happen from the exact same angle or tempo every time, so we wanna be able to train for that. The final sport is one near and dear to me, and that is dance. There's definitely a dispute on if dance is a true sport or not, but regardless, we can all agree that you must be athletic, so we are including it. Now in dance, you need to have great turnout or external hip rotation. To test for this, we're gonna do that same supine hip rotation test from the beginning of this section, but now we're gonna bring the foot across the midline. If you have any limitations, I'm gonna recommend a seated beast Pales Rails to create more space here. Sitting on the floor on a block, we're gonna get into a nice wide stance and hold this position for 2 minutes. For your Pales contraction, you wanna drive your arms down into your legs and try to close your legs together. Don't let yourself win and you're gonna feel a lot of inner thigh. For your Rails contraction, bring your arms in front of your chest and actively drive your knees down toward the ground. You're gonna feel your hip external rotators working here as you stay tall and breathe into the position. Now, once we've got a bit more space to work with, we can add in some sumo squats for our strength drill. I'm a sucker for a sumo squat, but it's probably because I have a ton of external hip rotation and I love working from this position. Now, I recommend using kettlebells because you're gonna have an easier time with your grip since they can tap the floor each time, but honestly, any weighted object will do here. All right, so hopefully you found this video helpful to just show you what functional training actually means. It's about looking at what you want out of your program and then finding the best path for you to get there. If you have any questions about a goal that you have and how to get there in the most efficient way possible, please leave it down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out, and I will see you all in the next one.